Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Leisowitz, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives and the Yale Project on Climate Change at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And I'd like to just first of all start by saying thank you to all of you for coming to the launch of the Visions of Sustainability lecture series. Today we are very fortunate to welcome Dr. Paul Raskin as our inaugural speaker in the series. And just to give you a little bit of background behind this series, this project emerged from a recent conference convened by the school in Aspen, Colorado, of leading natural and social scientists, philosophers, religious scholars, practitioners, and philanthropists that tried to identify the shift in underlying values and worldviews required to support a transition to sustainability in this century. Among its many conclusions, the group recognized that there is currently a critical need for inspiring yet practical visions of a sustainable world and roadmaps to help us get there. For decades, society, of course, has had to react to a seemingly endless series of environmental crises: oil spills, pollution, toxics, deforestation, endangered species, and now global environmental impacts. But in responding to these many threats, the environmental community has often, unfortunately, become better at articulating what it is against, climate change, deforestation, pollution, than articulating what it is for. Thus, the conference recognized that environmental research and action has often not been strategic in pursuit of a visionary goal and set of ideals. To quote the sociologist Amitai Etzioni, "Most people are not, nor do they seek to become policy wonks or technocrats. Most yearn for an overarching picture of what we are trying to achieve, one that provides a framework for placing specific ideas, assessing past accomplishments, and planning for the future. We seek a vision that inspires, compels, and gives meaning to our endeavors and sacrifices to life itself. It is now clear that the environmental crisis is global in scale, elongated in time, and interwoven with global trends far beyond the scope of conventional environmentalism. The environment can no longer be separated from issues like the current economic crisis, capital flows and globalization, advances in science, technology, and medicine, revolutions in computing and communications, mass urbanization and migrations, and changing lifestyles and levels of affluence around the world. It's growing clear that the world must make the transition to a sustainable and healthy planetary society, yet it is still very unclear to most of us what this sustainable future might look like or how to create it. In fact, confronted with the many problems of the world today, it's easy to become cynical or apathetic about the future. Yet, to quote Henry Ford, "Those who think they can and those who think they can't are both right." In this context, the lecture series hopes to help catalyze concrete visions of the economies, political systems, environments, values, and lifestyles of the sustainable world that does, in fact, lie within our reach. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Paul Raskin, Director of the Tellus Institute, who is one of the world's leading sustainability scientists. I'd also like to note that our second speaker in the series will be Alex Steffen, founder and director of worldchanging.org, which will be on May 8th over in Cruden Hall. His talk promises to be an inspiring look at innovative sustainability projects around the world. So now I'd like to take a moment to thank the Yale Office of Sustainability, our co-sponsor, and the Yale Sustainability Food Project for their support of today's lecture and their everyday efforts to make sustainability a reality right here, right now in New Haven. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Marian Chertow, Associate Professor of Industrial Environmental Management at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, who will introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and to welcome Paul. I see the problem like this. Tony says, what we need is a widely shared vision of how to get to sustainability, that perhaps environmentalists have been too much focused on the negative, what's wrong. And now we have Paul Raskin here, no one better qualified to present a vision of what that future could look like. So we're all very privileged. We're very privileged just to have eaten this wonderful food and to be feeling good already. But let me say something a little bit more formal about Paul and his work. I head the fan club, so I can, if you want to get little bumper stickers and stuff afterwards. First of all, I want to present that Paul Raskin has a very serious academic background. He's a physicist, both undergrad at Berkeley and PhD in theoretical physics from Columbia. You can see already that he's bicoastal. He's clearly has those academics roots. He was a professor for many years, and although he mostly taught physics, he did share with us at dinner last night, although without the guitar, that he did once teach a course called American History Through Folk Songs. So you can see that that playful part was always there. In 1976, he founded the TELUS Institute, which was kind of like a not-for-profit think tank consulting firm, and still is. One that has such intriguing studies that my colleagues and I see Reed Lipset in the back, we've been just using these studies and getting to know the researchers that you've assembled, Paul, over many years, because they are always a spark for the next thing. Subsequently, Paul started the Stockholm Environmental Institute in 1989, and also the Global Scenario Group. Finally, the Great Transition Initiative in 2003, the most recent of these institutions that you've built, and I think you'll hear a lot more about that today. So what I want to indicate is that what you'll hear Paul talk about is really based on a lot of very serious research centered on environmental policy, energy systems, freshwater sustainability, climate change, and so his group has designed a number of widely used planning models. Especially in the last 10 years or so, he's focused on integrated long-range scenarios at global, regional, and national scales. These are words, Paul, that have a lot of meaning to the people in this audience because we think about these things and we wish we could make these scenarios, and now we have you to guide us. I want to remind the audience these are not predictions. I think there are now more academic articles on how predictions fail as there were on the predictions themselves. So the fact that we have this more integrative form of scenario building is very important. And let me note that Paul has served as a lead author for the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the United Nations Environmental UNEP's Program on Global Environmental Outlook, and the U.S. National Academy of Science Board on Sustainable Development. So one scenario that I want to present to you in light of what we're about to hear as Paul looks back from the future to us is fasten your seatbelt. And another scenario I want to present is unfasten your seatbelt.
Well, thank you, Marion, for those generous words. It's really a pleasure to be back at Yale. Now, to convey just how great a pleasure it is, I want to begin by telling you about an incredibly realistic dream I had the other night. In it, and I kid you not, I was delivering this very presentation, but not in 2009. The year was 2084. And it began something like this. We gather here on the centennial of Orwell's nightmare year of 1984 to examine and celebrate a turbulent century that in the end brought not dystopia, but the global civilization we call Earthland. Now, you here at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies can take particular pride in this awakening. It is a fitting tribute to your visionary turn-of-the-century leader that our global university system carries the acronym GUS. So I woke up smiling, but I wanted to hear the rest of the lecture. So with your indulgence, I'd like to return to the future, to return to Earthland, this most fortunate denouement to a century that's getting off to such a dubious start. Now, in doing so, my aim is not to predict or offer a blueprint. The geography of the future is a terra incognita that lies beyond the ken of any scientific prediction or political philosophy. Visions of sustainable worlds are about possibilities, not probabilities. Still, Oscar Wilde once said, "A map without utopia on it is not worth living, not worth looking at," which I take to mean that even a crude vision of the destination can help motivate and guide the journey. Indeed, in these grave times, a collective failure to imagine the possible is itself a threat to sustainability. So I hope my story of the future will encourage you to think about your own versions. As Bob Dylan once put it, "I'll let you be in my dream if I can be in yours." So I stand before you at roughly 140 years of age, reasonably well preserved, if I say so myself. And you, citizens of Earthland, must be your own grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So off we go, Earthland or bust. Colleagues, a century into the planetary phase of civilization, as our macro historians now refer to the current era, it is timely to consider where we are and where we have been. I begin with a brief historical sketch. In a sense, our progenitors started down the road to Earthland when they journeyed out of Africa some 50,000 years ago on humanity's long march to the four corners of the planet. Over the millennia, ancient trade routes carried products and ideas over great distances. Conquering empires encompassed much of the then known world, and the great voyages wove the earliest strands of a web that would come to embrace the planet. Now, the planetary phase is the direct offspring of the modern era. Modernity's revolutions in science, religion, and society liberated vast latent human potential for knowledge, freedom, and progress. Eventually, the industrial explosion unleashed a previously unimaginable frenzy of acquisition and accumulation. By any gauge, the number of people, the scale of production, the pace of innovation, the era of exponential growth had arrived. But for all the wealth it created and ignorance it defeated, industrial capitalism brought unprecedented human suffering, encountering hard resistance at the moving frontier between modernist and traditionalist mindsets. Powerful movements for justice and environment arose, but could temper only the worst abuses. The economic growth machine just pushed on toward a world system, cashing out nature's bounty along the way. By the turn of the 21st century, the planetary phase had become a discernible historical phenomenon. An integrated global system was crystallizing with multiple manifestations: economic globalization, threats to the biosphere, distance shrinking technology, cultural interconnectivity and hostility, the explosion of civil society networks, and so on. The planetary phase was all of these developments and more. It was a systemic change in the mode of development that was eroding borders on maps and in minds, and enmeshing people and places in one global system with one shared destiny. The world itself was becoming a stage for crises, for contending forms of consciousness, and for social evolution. But in the early years of this century, Earthland had all the characteristics of a failed state. rampant poverty, immense inequality, degraded natural resources, conflict between hostile factions, and no legitimate constitutional authority. Spaceship Earth was flying into the future without benefit of flight plan or destination. The mood on board was a dismal mix of despair, distraction, and denial, the 3 Ds of an anxious culture. In those days, you didn't need to be a Cassandra to fear for the future. It was enough to be alert to the ominous reports that came like an incessant drumbeat. Now, conventional 21st century histories focus on the pivotal years 2018 to 2048, the so-called 30 years that shook the world. That story has 3 chapters. The time of troubles, the general crisis of 2018 to 2022. The House of Earth from 2022 to 2040 that ended the chaos and brought deep reforms and international cooperation. And the founding of modern Earthland, culminating in the World Constitution of 2048, the Global Agreement on Integrated Activity that we know as Gaia. However, to those 3 chapters, I would add a 4th, the decade prior to the crisis of 2018. In those critical years, a great wave of public engagement and awareness swept across the planet. This led to the formation of the nascent global citizens movement that was to become the indispensable change agent on the path to Earthland. Frankly, absent this movement, the Great Transition scenario would have probably been no more than a minor entry in the annals of utopian thought. Or more importantly, world history could have well veered toward the fortress world scenario that so many then feared. Indeed, it very nearly did. I refer here to the New Earth Order episode in the desperate 2020s. The NEOs were an international association of political, business, and military elements with the self-proclaimed mission of preventing global collapse. Their idea was to establish an emergency world authority that would impose martial law and seize control of vital resources. Well, in the event, this grandiose cabal was rather short-lived and farcical, and during their long years of detention, the NEOs had ample time to ponder their miscalculations. For all the while, the global citizens movement was edging toward its tipping point. Now, the civil society activism of the 1990s and 2000s was a glimpse of what was to come. That eruption brought great energy and diversity to 1,000 issues, but was limited by organizational fragmentation, theoretical incoherence, and the lack of a compelling alternative vision. Progress painstakingly won here and there was overwhelmed by systemic deterioration. Local success stories did not add up to a new pathway for global development. The civil society upsurge both made the global citizens movement possible and highlighted its necessity. 4 developments were critical for this evolutionary coalescence. First, the movement cultivated unity through a politics of trust, a commitment to seeking common ground and building bridges, to tolerating proximate differences in order to nurture the ultimate basis for solidarity. Second, it offered a systemic conceptual framework for connecting issues as part of a common project for social and ecological transformation. Third, its pragmatic vision provided a coherent, legitimate, and rigorous alternative that inspired hope and confidence. And fourth, its strategic sophistication brought victories and in their wake, new adherents. Beyond the tipping point was a bandwagon. The global citizens movement was the tangible political and cultural expression of this great transition. But it was rooted in a parallel transition then underway in the realm of the human heart. People were returning to the most fundamental questions. How shall we live? Who should we be? What matters? Gradually, the dominant values of yesteryear, consumerism, individualism, anthropocentrism, were giving way to a new triad: quality of life, human solidarity, and an ecological sensibility. This emerging suite of values was to become the very foundation of the entire edifice of contemporary planetary society. Today, these are expressed in varying weights and meanings across our diverse region, but are the sine qua non nearly everywhere. Let's consider the three values in turn. That the enhancement of the quality of life should be the goal of development is now so self-evident, it must be remembered that over the eons, the problem of scarcity and survival, what Keynes called the economic problem, dominated existence. Then, with the industrial cornucopia, the historic possibility opened for a post-scarcity civilization. Our ethic of material sufficiency has roots in the early decades of the transition, when the search began for more meaningful and satisfying ways of living than the work and buy treadmill had on offer. Today, people are as ambitious as ever, but fulfillment, not wealth, is the primary measure of success and source of well-being. The second value, human solidarity, expresses a sense of connectedness with people in distant places and the unborn who will live in a distant time. It is a manifestation of the capacity for reciprocity and empathy that lies deep in the human psyche. The golden rule that is a thread across the world's religions. As a secular doctrine, it is the basis for the ideals of democracy, tolerance, respect, equality, and rights. Finally, with their strong ecological sensibility, people today are mystified and horrified by the feckless indifference of earlier generations. Where the right to dominate nature was once held sacrosanct, people today hold a deep reverence for the natural world, finding in it endless wonder and enjoyment. Rapacious no more, our relationship to the earth is tempered by the humility that comes with understanding humanity's place in the web of life and dependence on its bounty. I'd like to turn now to the political structure of Earthland and our slogan, one world, many places. Now, throughout history, the ambit of interpersonal affiliation has expanded. Family, clan, tribe, village, city, nation. Today, identity and citizenship has reached the level of the planet. Now, this possibility had long been dismissed by mainstream political theory, and that skepticism should not be surprising. Looking forward, world historic shifts in popular consciousness can seem impossibly quixotic. Looking back, they can come to seem inevitable. For example, from the vantage point of late feudal society with its deeply entrenched hierarchical relationships, nationalism would have seemed a rather dreamy vision of the future. Yet in the course of a mere couple centuries, the pre-modern mosaic of fiefdoms and principalities and duchies and tribes and city-states was transformed into a world map entirely etched with sovereign nation-states. Once established, territorial nations came to be seen as natural, permanent, and even hallowed building blocks of the political order. Now, globalism may be as deep-rooted as nationalism once was. I mean, perhaps more so. After all, when we travel to space and look back, we see an integral blue planet, not the imaginary boundaries of territorial nation-states. Now, this 21st century zeitgeist of global cosmopolitanism was propelled by both idealism and pragmatism, the aspiration for an authentic world community, and the practical expediency for planetary cooperation. Both the pull of hope and the push of fear forged the global citizen. In the planetary phase, and this is, I think, a key point, as an interdependent world became faced with common risks, the ancient dream of one world finally became anchored in the objective historical conditions. Earth and humanity were becoming a single community of fate. Now, of course, Earthland's cosmopolitan principles did not fall from the sky. The long struggles for rights, peace, development, and environment were our indispensable prerequisites and inspiration. The World Constitution builds on such milestones as the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 2002 Earth Charter, and especially the 2015 Declaration of Interdependence that was adopted at the first Intercontinental Congress of the Global Citizens Movement. Be there. But our commitment to one world is balanced by an equal commitment to many places. The fabric of our society is woven with hundreds of regions of astonishing variety. Although an exhaustive survey is not possible here, a crude taxonomy of basic regional forms is illuminating. Most regions can be coupled into one of three major regional types, which I will call Agoria, Ecodemia, and Arcadia. Now, these whimsical names rely on Greek roots to evoke the classical ideal of political community, active citizens, shared purpose, and just social relations. In Athens, the agora was both the marketplace and the center of political life. Thus, commerce figures prominently in agoria. The neologism ecodemia combines the word roots of economy and democracy. Thus, economic democracy is a priority in these regions. Arcadia was the bucolic place of Greek myth. Thus, local community and simpler lifestyles are particularly significant here. Now, before describing these places further, I want to underscore that these are archetypes. Actual regions are rarely pure cases. And let's remember, some troubled regions are still mired in the conflicts of the past and have yet to solidify a clear identity within Earthland. Now, Agorian regions would be most recognizable to a visitor from a century ago. Relative to other regions, they tend to be more conventional in lifestyles and institutions. Their economies are largely based on shareholder corporations, and investment capital is privately held. But a comprehensive regulatory framework aligns business behavior with social goals in order to maintain highly equitable, responsible, and environmental societies. The distinguishing feature of ecodemia is its fundamental departure from capitalism. Its system of economic democracy banishes the capitalists from two crucial arenas of economic life. First, the conventional model of the firm based on private owners and hired workers has been replaced by worker-owned enterprises, along with nonprofits and highly regulated small businesses. Second, private capital markets have given way to socialized investment processes in which publicly controlled regional and community banks apply social, environmental, and financial criteria in recycling social savings. Arcadia features more self-reliant economies, smaller enterprises, and face-to-face democracy, at least in cyberspace. These are relatively time-rich and slow-moving places. But at the same time, Arcadia hosts centers of innovation in such areas as organic agriculture, modular solar technology, and human-scale transport devices. And as you know, Arcadia is the source of considerable artistic ferment. Now, some argue that these three regional types, Agoria, Ecodemia, and Arcadia, are descendants of the three political isms, capitalism, socialism, and anarchism. Although I find this claim to be rather facile, I must acknowledge its grain of truth. After all, Agoria's market emphasis does give it a capitalist orientation. Some pundit recently called Agoria Sweden supreme. Ecodemia's insistence on the primacy of social ownership was the essence of classical socialism. Arcadia's stress on small-scale endeavors was central to the humanistic anarchist tradition. But these ideological associations mask as much as they reveal. Agoria's dedication to sustainability and justice is of a different order than even the most outstanding social democracies of the past. Ecodemia's commitment to democracy, rights, and environment bears little resemblance to the autocratic socialist experiments of the 20th century. Arcadia's highly sophisticated societies are enthusiastic participants in world affairs, not the pastoral utopias of the old anarchist dreamers. Now, one of our greatest challenges has been fashioning a workable balance between the competing imperatives of global responsibility and regional autonomy. The solution was remarkably simple, though it was long invisible because of the mystifications of the Cold War, the era of the hegemon, the Great Recession, and then the time of troubles. Earthland's political philosophy rests on the principle of constrained pluralism. Let me explain. Constrained pluralism includes three complementary ideas: irreducibility, subsidiarity, and heterogeneity. The irreducibility principle states that the adjudication of certain issues is necessarily and properly retained at the global level of governance. The subsidiarity principle dictates that the scope of irreducible global authority be sharply limited. That is, to promote effectiveness, transparency, and participation, decision-making should be guided to the most local level feasible. The heterogeneity principle validates the rights of regions to pursue diverse forms of development, constrained only by their obligations to meet global responsibilities. Now, these principles are enshrined in the World Constitution, and it would be difficult to find anyone who finds them objectionable. However, their implementation in practice is a matter for the political arena. What should be considered irreducibly global is a tug-of-war between advocates for a more tight-knit world state and those for a more regionally based commonwealth. Nevertheless, the consensus is strong on the core responsibilities of global governance: human rights, care for the biosphere, peace and justice, world commerce and finance, space exploration, planetary infrastructure, and of course the aforementioned global university system. Now, the World Assembly includes both regional representatives and at-large members selected by popular vote in worldwide elections. At-large representation gives voice to one world politics, stimulating, for example, the formation of world parties as a counterweight to regional parochialism. Strong regional representation ensures that the many places are not forgotten. This balance safeguards against tyranny from above or below. And, of course, the global citizens movement is still at it, educating, monitoring, and where necessary, protesting. Now, today the economy is understood as a means to social and environmental ends rather than an end in itself. The forms of business enterprises are highly varied. Nonprofits continue to surge, particularly in academia and Arcadia, but also in Agoria. Business forms include the worker-owned cooperatives of academia, the small private operations typical of Arcadia, and the corporations of Agoria, long ago rechartered to ensure primacy of social purpose, not shareholder profit. Also, a labor-intensive secondary economy has expanded alongside the high-tech base. This so-called people's economy produces a breathtaking array of aesthetic goods and skilled services. Now, with the exception of a small group of regional parties that advocate extreme autarky, the consensus is strong that global trade is a legitimate feature of Earthland's economy. That legitimacy does not rest, however, on the discredited arguments of neoclassical economics that equate free trade with efficiency and development. Rather, our trade regime is designed to help bind a world culture while taking care not to subvert regional prerogatives. Our dispute resolution system is busy indeed mediating this boundary. Now, the world economy has quadrupled since the early years of this century, and with tighter distributions of income between and within regions, the material well-being of the average citizen is far higher. Everyone has a right to a basic standard of living, provided through a guaranteed minimum income, a full employment policy, or a more traditional welfare system, depending on the regional approach. Now, it is true that in a place like the United States, average income today is somewhat lower than back then. But the comparison is misleading. In those days, the GDP included enormous waste and defensive expenditure, and average incomes were elevated by a bygone class of the super rich. Real measures of well-being and development have never been higher. Now, along the way, Earthland's egalitarian values and muted class distinctions have helped erode old bigotries. After generations of struggle, equality for women and minorities is close at hand. This would not have happened and would remain vulnerable to stagnation or even reversal without the continued vigilance of our rights movements. On the environmental front, Earthland inherited the terrible legacy of a degraded biosphere and destabilized climate. The ecological emergency of the first half of this century was nearly catastrophic. But it did spawn the vibrant environmentalism that was so essential to the vitality of the global citizens movement and the birth of Earthland as we know it. Today, we mourn what has been lost, but take comfort in knowing that our damaged planet is on the path to recovery. Now, the story of the sustainability transition has oft been told, the turning toward less material-intensive consumption patterns, the creation of closed-loop industrial ecologies, the big push on efficiency and renewables, the ecological agricultural revolution, the greening of transport systems. In addition, the Great Transition has also been a demographic transition. Population is stabilizing at about 7 billion, some 2 billion below turn-of-the-century projections. All the more remarkable since life expectancy is now approaching 100 years. The decrease in fertility rates was largely due, of course, to the empowerment of women and the CRASH program to eliminate poverty. Now, another important driver of sustainability was the move toward more compact settlement patterns, like the popular town within the city that place home, work, commerce, and leisure in close proximity. Along with advanced virtual workplaces, this new metropolitan vision has abolished the traffic-clogged commutes and the airport mayhem that once tortured working men and women. People walk, bike, and use high-tech transportation networks that link communities to local hubs, those hubs to one another and larger cities. And people still drive, but more sparingly, often for touring and special errands. The restoration of the biosphere remains a powerful collective enterprise of the country of Earthland. People monitor environmental indicators as closely as they do sports results or weather forecasts. Happily, we are on track to reach the goal set back in 2025 of reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations to 350 parts per million by the end of this century. The next campaign, now in the works, to return concentrations to pre-industrial levels will keep climate change at the forefront of our concerns for decades to come. Now, this extension of life expectancy and smaller family size has led to adjustments in family structures. While the traditional nuclear family is still common in most regions and prevalent in Agoria, alternative living arrangements have also proliferated, such as ecodemia's intentional communities, often organized around workplace collectives, and Arcadia's many communal experiments. Diversity in living choices is part and parcel of the age of tolerance and pluralism. It's even the case that some people are still enthralled by conspicuous consumption, though they tend to be seen as rather vulgar and unevolved. For most, the pursuit of money has given ground to the pursuit of creative skills, relationships, communities, and the life of the mind, all made possible by the abundance of a once scarce commodity, time. The old cynics who feared the masses would squander abundant free time were mistaken. The humanists who spoke of untapped human potential for cultivating the art of life were on point. If there are limits to our goals and capacities, we are not yet near them. Well, the future is rushing toward me, but I'll briefly mention three broad tendencies in the area of religion and spirituality: secularization, experimentation, and reinvention. First, people increasingly find meaning and transcendence in the down-to-earth marvels of art, life, and nature. Second, a profusion of experimental religions offer unique blends of mythology and metaphysics and the comforts of collective ritual. Third, the major religions have reinvented themselves as strong bearers of our core planetary values. The Great Transition was, in part, a battle for the soul of the church, mosque, temple, and synagogue. Ultimately, those rooting tolerance and sustainability in theological tradition prevailed. I do want to confess, though, some concern about a spiritual restlessness that seems to be spreading among some of our young people. Finding the challenges of the planetary phase rather old hat, these children of Earthland are searching for new frontiers. Many are drawn to the post-mundial movement with its dream of space colonization and contact with a still wider community of life. I don't think I'm the only veteran of the Great Transition, mindful of the unfinished transformation right here on the home planet, who find ourselves in the unfamiliar and uncomfortable role of the skeptic. Earthland has accomplished a great deal, but remains a work in progress. We are real people facing real challenges, Pockets of poverty remain, conflict flares on occasion, greed and intolerance are still with us, and the ecosphere still suffers from old wounds. The only certainty about the future is surprise, the one constant change. Still, we are healing and learning and looking ahead with hope and enthusiasm. History is unfolding in a theater of possibility that few would trade. For this gift, we are indebted to those who rose to the promise of the planetary phase when the century was still young. Living in yesterday's tomorrow, we can confirm what they could only imagine. Another world was possible. Thank you.
Well, Earth citizens, you may have some questions. And I just wanted to throw one out because I'm sure everyone is as curious about this as I am, and that is, Paul, can you just share with us some of the trends that you saw in your research that led you to envisioning going this way?
Well, my own journey of discovery, in my own career, what I have, I guess, had the good fortune that my research interests have tracked the changing times, so that the issues that I was studying became more extended in space, arched over greater periods of time, and became more integrated in a complex systemic framework. So one of the trends is an awareness of the interconnection between these various issues and the need to address them not slicing and dicing in a piecemeal fashion, but through a holistic process of transformation that can be synergistic. Otherwise, we're not going to get there. Other trends, for me, are being involved with this wonderful proliferation of international groups who are involved in all of these issues and themselves are very responsive to this idea that, getting people out of their separate tents under the same umbrella, they begin to see that the challenges that they are facing, whether it be in environment issues, climate rights, poverty, and so on, are expressions of the same phenomena, and therefore the dialogue that happens there can be very powerful in discovering an awareness of how to deal with those collectively. So that's what I say would be another trend. A third, I think, is starting to see, I think in an increasing way, in perhaps a latent way, the blooming of these values that I discussed, these alternative values.
Hi, I'm Eva, and I'm a second-year Master's of Environmental Management student at the Forestry School. And I wanted to ask, it sounds like your observation of the importance of these different social movements and groups harkens back to, or refers to what has been described by Hawken in his description of all the groups that have emerged on these different topics. But in your speech, you talk about the global citizens movement. And do you think that a unification of these different sort of separate trends is required to move forward through the Great Transition?
That's just a great question. My own feeling is that faith that the spontaneous actions of these dispersed groups, of which there are tens of thousands, a lot of quiet heroes out there, the faith that will aggregate as an agent of change at the scale of the challenge is just that. It's a matter of faith. And that it is important for us to think about historically, when you have had systemic change, it involved a coming together of groups who began to identify themselves in a more systemic way that could address the underlying roots of the problem. So, as I said in my presentation, and I'll say it again, I think the civil society movement is the precondition. It's the necessary condition, but it's not the sufficient condition for the transition because of this fragmentation, this almost, and in some cases, this almost philosophical concern about an integrated narrative of what could happen, and also the lack of being willing or able to describe what that other world is in the slogan, another world is possible. So I think that to get from that stage of just this kind of popcorn going off of tens of thousands of activists, which often leads, I'm afraid, to feelings of frustration among them, resignation, and often despair and burnout. One needs a more sustained and holistic process. I call it the global citizens movement. When I was your age, the civil rights movement was happening, and it was in the air. And then at one point, very rapidly, it became kind of like a unified zeitgeist that got such political momentum that it actually changed history. I think we're in that period before that crystallization. So we need to push on all these fronts, but I'm expecting and actually actively trying to cultivate a discourse where we can talk about this global citizens movement in a way that rejects both the faith in bottom-up spontaneity reaching a coherence that's equal to the challenge, but also the old idea of the top-down notion of leadership. We need to invent a form of means that's consistent with the ends of Earthland. Yeah.
Hi there, my name is Seth, also from the Forestry School. And my question is, in order to achieve these future scenarios you've described, corporations and capital, productivity has been tamed in some way. And I'm wondering, and also the way in which politics is employed has been changed as well. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of insights on how one might go about taming the corporation, both in terms of allowing us to be more than just investors and consumers, and also taming them in the political sphere so that we can actually activate our ability to choose on terms that exceed just investment and consumption.
No, I think my answer would have been different 6 months ago than it is now. I think we've actually been seeing sort of a sea change in this kind of faith in unregulated free markets. Yeah.
Can I refine my question then slightly? Because it's to my mind, it's not the question of the structured regulations, it's the purpose behind the system. I don't see any transformation in the idea that the economy is primarily about the generation of wealth.
Yes.
Of the products.
Yes, I concur. My preface is only to perhaps make my response more plausible. I don't think we ought to have unitary answers to questions like this, and this is sort of like the strategy behind having multiple regions and all that. There's no question that the basic charters, the basic corporate charters, would have to be transformed in anything like the world I'm talking about here. So, the corporation is itself historically constituted. Its modern form has not been around that many centuries. So in that process, one would have to actually change the governance and the legal requirements of corporate identity, which is what would happen in a place like Agoria. So even today, you find gradations. If you're in Sweden, looking at the kind of framework that and the attitudes even, the values and the attitudes in the corporate world, it is slightly different than the US. And one has to imagine here, I think, a situation where the basic motivations that, a corporation is an evolutionary, it's in an ecology, it's an evolutionary system, and people in them are fine people, but they have to conform to the logic of that system. You have to change the logic. You can't change the logic without changing corporate charters. You can't change the corporate charters unless there's the political space for doing that. You don't have the political space for doing that unless there's a global citizens movement.
Hi, my name's Fran Moore. I'm a student at the Forestry School. And in your narrative, you kind of described a time of trouble. In other words, things are getting worse before they're getting better. I was wondering, do you see that as a kind of a crisis moment, as a necessary condition for this great transformation? And if so, how bad do things have to get before they start getting better?
Well, we need Alice in Wonder. Is it Alice in Wonderland? No, it's who's the one with the three bears? Yes, not too much, not too little, just right. Actually, in '95, I formed this global scenario group to help try to think this through. And the only way we could actually get consensus on this really sea change in consciousness and institutions was by putting in our narrative a systemic crisis. I think that what's happening now is we're moving towards a place where there is a tremendous interaction between social, environmental, and economic systems in ways that are very hard to map. And the causalities are reciprocal and really hard to sort out. My own guess is that we are probably facing some kind of systemic crisis. I don't think what we're seeing today is the big one. I think what we're seeing today is largely an event within the economy. So when I talk about the time of troubles of 2018, 2022, I see it as a systemic event where there could be all sorts of feedback. Climate change is happening, social disruption, migration, feeds back on the economy in ways you can't even track. And unfortunately, that kind of rippling and cascading effect could be triggered by any number of events, like an abrupt change in climate that comes sooner than we hope, like a macro terrorist attack, like peak oil, like a pandemic, and so on. So, the key point, again, is the next 10 years. Insofar as there is this emergence of this global engagement, two things happen. First of all, it ameliorates the crisis because people would be involved in pushing a guy like Obama to do the right thing. Second of all, it allows you, if there is a crisis, to recover from the crisis so you don't go towards the neos, towards the fortress world scenario, that there are institutions and connectivity in place that allows for a creative and progressive response to it. So, I don't predict, but I think the way the world bifurcates over the next 10 or 20 years will be sensitively dependent on what happens in the coming period.
I enjoyed, my name's Gloria Light, I'm the wife of an alumnus. I was very happy to hear about 2084 and the upside, but I couldn't quite quell my realism. And I was wondering, what you would do between now and 2025 to deal with such issues as human aggression, destructiveness, violence, and weapons in some magical way.
Yeah. Well, we're never going to get rid of those things. But at the same time, human cultures and human beings are social. We're social animals, and we have evolved and changed over time. What I'm trying to argue here is that the very forces that are leading to the emergency are forging the basis for transcending it, so that it's not just that we decide to be different, that the idea of Earthland becomes not only a good idea, it becomes a necessity at this period of history, a possibility and a necessity for survival even. So these are the objective conditions that I think will and are. I mean, I see this around the world. People are changing and starting to plug in and become aware of what's going on. It's not a majority, but it's a growing minority. So, what I'm trying to paint a picture here is not of a utopia. As I say, we're real people, and we got problems and crises and all these kinds of things. We probably even have Earthland probably has an intervention force to prevent wars between regions. So I don't think we want to be saying that we have eradicated, these basic things. However, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of tolerance and democracy and so on and so forth, have taken a hit over the last couple hundred years. If it is not the case that this current phase of history is going to cultivate those enlarged values and moderate behaviors, then we do get a fortress world. So, we're still in the game here. But pessimism is its own reward. I mean, if we're inactive and we assume that, climate disaster is a done deal, you can count on it. It's a done deal. So we have to make this kind of a bargain. I think it was Antonio Gramsci that once said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Because the choices that we make are part of the objective conditions that will determine whether or not there is a basis for optimism.
I'm Roland Clement, an old-fashioned environmentalist. I came here to the School of Forestry 20 years ago as a visiting fellow to begin discussing these themes. So what I'd suggested that you and the faculty agreed to do this 5 years in a row to find out how many of these utopian themes, which must be utopian, are picked up by the graduate students and developed so that we can act on them.
Yes, my name is John. I'm part of the wider community here. I understand that you're working to be a crystallizer of some of these various pieces of popcorn. I'm curious about the crystallization process, if you could talk about the process of that, and also about if you could discuss any other crystallizers, for lack of a better term, in this country or in the wider planetary world that are also doing this work.
Well, let me give you a physicist's answer to start with. That all complex dynamic systems reach critical thresholds where things happen fast and unpredictably, where they bifurcate into different possible trajectories, all compatible with the existing conditions, which is only to say that the possibility of crystallization or a phase shift is really very compatible with any system that's in a turbulent phase. You can mount considerable evidence to say that we are in such a pre-crystallization phase, that we've kind of entered this period of turbulence and uncertainty, that some form of global society will crystallize in the coming decades, but that its form remains very uncertain and very contentious, actually. I think that the analogy I was using to somebody earlier today was the idea of a saturated liquid. So you know how you pour sugar in your high school beaker, and it fills up and you can't see the sugar, right? But it's saturated, so it becomes very sensitive to any disturbance. So you tap on the beaker and it crystallizes a bunch of sugar. Okay, I think that there's an analogy here with cultural crystallization. I think there are a lot of people are going through a lot of awareness building, a lot of changing, a lot of reflection. And I am making the assumption, I don't think we're at the saturated point now where a mere tip on the glass will make a difference. What I see myself doing and my colleagues doing is we're still pouring sugar in, to try to bring people to that tipping point. I do want to personally experiment with the idea that I mentioned in the talk of an intercontinental Congress. There are parallel groups in Europe, actually everywhere. There are parallel groups that have popped up who you could say bear a family resemblance to each other. They're trying to sort out this question of transition, the question of Earthland, which I call Earthland. And we are now, just as we speak, making contact with all those organizations and see if we can get an initiative of initiatives and maybe build towards this Intercontinental Congress to see if we've reached that saturation point. I don't know. I've considered this an experimental science, and I have great respect for the complexity and uncertainty of this situation. So I think we need to be adaptive. I think we need to have like a sailor, your eyes on the destination, but you're tacking in different ways depending on what you learn and what evolves and what develops. But I think we're personally that we're close enough to run the experiment. And actually it's rather urgent, I would say. So.
Right. Hi, Mike Cohen. I'm an energy auditor locally. And, there's a feeling that our corporate structures have failed us, and indeed they have. But it appears that they've also failed the stockholders, so they're not acting the way one would expect them to act anyway. Now, if we want to change things, there's facts and systems and values. And the environmental movement wants us to have foresight so that we can value things that will happen in the future that are becoming apparent now. Rather than try and get people to act against what they perceive as their values, can't we just sort of use the corporate structure, which is a very useful beast, but just put it in a structure where, number one, we correct the imbalance of the owners versus the managers, and number two, we cause them to pay for their externalities because they're not capable of working against their economic interests. But if we just, have a carbon tax and many things like that, maybe we can get them pulling in the right direction again without having to redo the whole world.
Well, here. I think if we can do that, we're well on the way to the transition. There was Karl Polanyi, who some of you may have read, had a book called The Great Transformation that he wrote in 1944 in the middle of the agony of World War II. And he makes a very interesting point that up until this great transformation, which is really industrial capitalism, economies were inside societies. That the economies played the role of binding relationships and so on in traditional society. And that what's happened since then is that the society is inside the economy. So more and more things get marketized and privatized and so on. So when we talk about what you're saying, it really is, more than just a set of reforms. I think it really is a fundamental rethink on the development model. So absolutely, in the short term, everyone's a reformist. How can we change and fix things? In the long term, we better be, visionaries. And we need to work both of those. There are time scale tensions between environmental and economic concerns. I mean, for example, probably the best thing that's happened for climate change, I'm afraid, is the economic downturn. And yet there's a considerable suffering going on among marginal people in the world. How do we get these pictures into sync? Well, that's our challenge, is to find the way to tell a story that no matter how you come into this tent, the environment, the economy, you're part of that narrative. Okay. So we need to work on your program at the same time, keep that vision alive. Yeah.
We're winding down. I'd like to go to the front row.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jude. I'm also a student at the forestry school. So I think it's very compelling, this vision that due to the forces of hope and fear, that we will get ourselves to the point of a great transition. But like all, I think, living things, humans relate to that stimulus of crisis, except that unlike other living things, we have the potential of making that great transition have a positive or a negative outcome. And so it seems to me that the only way to ensure that this type of crisis leads to the global community is a sea change in underlying values. And my question to you is, what kinds of things can we do to compel people who may not already share that type of values to shift to the ones that would lead to a global community? Are they, specifically things like education, they just need to understand the problems more? Is it that we need to bring them into our community so that they see the contentment and quality of life once you have these values? Is it stimulating more empathy, taking them out to a wasteland and opening up the floodgates of that? What kinds of things can we do?
I think that the human predicament of the 21st century is doing a lot of our work for us by discrediting old values and bringing people to an awareness. I think there's 3 areas that we need to make immediate progress in, which I call understanding, vision, and action. Okay? Understanding, we just need to get a better grasp, a better understanding of this emergent world system so that we can, with rigor, be able to communicate this to people and to get people more aware of the fact that in this kind of condition, if you care about your place, if you care about your family, you better care about your globe. So this understanding, both scientific and in popular culture, is one area. Vision. If you were alive in the 19th century, you would have had a vision. You had a Marxist vision of the alternative, and it was able to galvanize a lot of the discontent that was around then. We don't have a vision. So we don't have a legitimate and coherent story to tell about how we can move towards this Earthland, and we know how to keep the lights on, so to speak. So we need to get together and enhance this vision and debate it and pull it together. And it might have many different forms, and at the same time, it might have underlying shared contours. Third area is action. I've said a lot about that. Please, 2015, be at that first meeting of the Global Citizens Movement. But I do want to say that. All right, let me see if I can remember these lines from Seamus Heaney, who said, history says, do not hope this side of the grave. Then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. Well, in these kinds of crisis periods, the old structures that contain consciousness and institutions start to weaken, and it opens space for rapid change. And I think this is what Margaret Mead meant when she talked about, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever had. So I think this is a great time to be alive, that you guys have the opportunity to make your hopes for the future rhyme with your vision of the future. Thank you very much.